Hi, this is Jerry Werhoftig, and in this two-part video, I'm going to give you a simple demonstration on two different ways to make hollow beads. I'm going to be working with black glass, and I suggest that if you're new at soft glass hollow beads, you start with a transparent color, and black in the Italian palette is in fact a transparent color. I'm preheating my bead release, and now I'm going to make two discs of glass opposing each other. If you haven't seen my earlier tutorial on discs, it would probably be better to stop now and go watch that video. I'm going to start with two discs. The mandrel is rolling away from me before I touch it, and this first wrap of glass will be the footprint for one of my two discs. Now, before, had to grab my tweezers. Before it has melted all the way down on the mandrel, I do have an opportunity to pinch this a little thinner if that's what I want to do. Usually I do that by holding the left side of the tweezer still and bringing the right side in to meet it. That way, if the left-hand disc does have a little bit of a ragged hole, the ragged hole is inside the bead. Now I'm going to do the opposite on the right-hand disc. By that I mean I'm going to, sorry about the phone, I'm going to make the right-hand disc by rolling the glass onto the mandrel. And again, if I feel the need to make it a little more narrow, which I really don't here, but for demonstration's sake, I would hold the right jaw of the tweezer still and bring the left over to meet the disc. And that way, again, any little pinched edge of glass ends up inside the bead. Now, the primary difference between this tutorial for a typical hollow bead and the one that I will do in the next video using the puffy mandrel is that in order to avoid a collapse from molten glass, this bead needs to be made with thinner discs than the puffy mandrel requires. I would say that these wraps of glass are going on at around 2 to 3 millimeters, and they could be at least a millimeter thicker if I was using the puffy mandrel. So in order to get a sense of what that means, you're going to have to look at both videos and just see the relative differences. Once I have two discs, I'm going to be mindful that the thinner the disc, the more likely it is to be sensitive to shock from changes in temperature. So I'm going to be mindful that I want to direct the flame up toward the flat sides of the disc, catching both the first disc and a little bit of the second one every time I roll it in the heat. That way, my discs won't collapse and become round beads, but they will stay warm enough that they won't shock apart when I add hot glass to them. If you've been trying to make discs and you find that your wraps of glass are shocking off and ending up all over the table, you're probably not keeping your discs warm enough, because what you want is a heat base in the edge of the disc and in the molten glass that is relatively similar. So I'm going to bring the edge of the disc up to a dull glow and then add my molten glass. That way there's not a huge difference in the temperature of the rim of the disc as compared with the gather. So now that I have two discs that are relatively close in size, they don't have to be exact, I've started to build them in toward each other so that the left-hand disc will start to cup toward the right-hand disc. Now, there's a lot of ways to do this. This is just one way. Some people would pinch the two discs together. There's a lovely tool made by Heather Trimlett that you can use. It's a marver that will bring the two discs together. This is one method, and I think it's a good starting place for beginners. Now notice, as I add the wraps, I still need to remember to stop and heat the faces of the discs so that down where they meet the mandrel, which is really not an area that I'm heating or adding molten glass to, they still are not getting so cold that they will shock. At this point, what I'm doing is I'm going to close up these two discs, and I can do this with a combination of adding my very last wrap of glass. See how it almost fills the gap between the two discs, not quite. And after I finish going around with this wrap, I'll use a tool or maybe a rod of glass to nudge these two discs toward each other. Now, people are very worried about manipulating these discs, but the truth is they can only move if they're glowing or very warm. And so I'm not worried about over here. I'm not touching that with my tool. I'm just using my knife to kind of urge these wraps toward each other. Now, I will add one more wrap to close up big open spaces. But where beginners go wrong is they kind of dab glass into every hole they see. They perhaps didn't add their wraps evenly, and so they've got all these little pinholes, and they pour on a ton of glass in those pinholes. And what they do is you create heavy spots in your bead. So I only want to use the glass that I need to seal this up. Now, I left one hole. I wanted to show you what to do. See this hole? I hope that you can see it when it's glowing. Can you see that hole there? So what I'm going to do is use my warm rod, heat up the hole, and then just use my rod to kind of smush the glass to fill that spot. By doing that, and of course I opened another hole next to it, so I'll close that hole too. By doing that, though, I haven't added any glass. And so even though I may have created a little smushed spot that is going to have to be smoothed out, that is far preferable to the weight of dabbing in lots of extra glass. So now I'm going to use my marver to just kind of smooth some spots. I'm going to take this moment to look for any holes, pinholes. They tend to glow differently. Some people say they hold the bead under the bench to look at it when it's glowing hot. I personally just find I use my eyes. I do see that there's one little pinhole here that, let's see, I lost it. It was left open and it may have closed itself up. Nope, there it is. So because I see a little hole, I'm gonna add a little glass to it, but I'm going to try to make it as little glass as possible, because when I melt this bead into a hollow bead, the first thing that happens is the entire bead becomes molten. If it is also hollow with a solid walls, no pinholes, it will expand or slightly puff due to the warm air that's inside the bead. But that only works if you have no holes in your walls. And so I am gently introducing heat to this bead. I'm going to heat it from one hole to the other. My goal is that before the whole thing is soupy and molten, if I see any little pinholes opening up, I saw one there, I still can grab it and close it with a tool. Sometimes you see people do this. They heat the bead on an angle and then on another angle. The theory behind that is if there are little spaces between the wraps of glass, tipping the bead helps them sort of snug up against each other and closes any little gaps. So the skill here is to make your discs thin enough that as you heat up the bead at this point, It can contract a little bit as it gets molten and then expand a little bit as it fills with warm air. If your discs are too heavy, especially if you've been patching them in a million places, you'll have better luck with a puffy mandrel, because if your discs are that heavy, the bead will collapse before it has a chance to expand. With the exception of the thickness of the discs and the ability of a puffy mandrel to expand using your breath, making hollow beads on a regular mandrel and on a puffy mandrel are extremely similar. So here is, you can see my hollow bead. It's not quite smooth yet, but I'm going to come out of the flame just so you can see the progress at this point. There's your hollow bead, and I could certainly now decorate it. I could even mash it if I wanted to. I could roll it on a marver if I wanted to change its perimeter, its equator profile. You know, there's a lot of options. So there's your beginner hollow done with a standard 3/32 inch mandrel, soft glass on a Mega Minor torch. In the second video, I will do a hollow bead using a puffy mandrel.